Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a subject that's woven into the very fabric of the United States, Native Americans. Our goal today is to go beyond the surface level, beyond those common stereotypes, and equip you with a deeper understanding of this complex topic.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the nuances, the layers of history, and the ongoing fight for self-determination that continues to shape Native American lives today.
Okay, so before we get lost in the twists and turns of history, let's start with the basic question. Who are we talking about when we say Native Americans?
That's a great place to start, because even the terminology is complex. The U.S. Census Bureau defines Native Americans as people with origins in North and South America who maintain tribal affiliation. But here's the catch. Native American itself isn't a census category, it's a broader term, encompassing groups like Native Hawaiians who are actually counted separately.
So right off the bat, we're dealing with a term that's both widely used and officially kind of fuzzy. It reminds me of how some people use Native American and American Indian interchangeably, but there are folks who feel strongly about one term over the other.
Exactly. Terminology is a minefield, reflecting the power dynamics and the fight for recognition that have shaped the Native American experience. We'll definitely circle back to these debates later, but for now, let's take a trip back in time, way back to pre-Columbian America.
Okay, set the scene for us. What was North America like before European contact?
Imagine a continent teeming with a tapestry of cultures, languages, and societal structures that were vastly different from what the arriving Europeans were used to. You had sophisticated civilizations like the Cahokia in the Mississippi Valley, the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest mastering desert agriculture, the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast with their intricate political system.
So not just scattered tribes, but complex societies, organized in ways that challenged European assumptions.
Precisely. And one of the most profound differences was in their relationship to land. Many Native American societies had a collective approach to land ownership, viewing it as a shared resource rather than individual property. This fundamental difference set the stage for conflict as European settlers, driven by ideas of private ownership, sought to claim and control territory.
Okay, so enter the Europeans in the late 15th century. We all know the story. Columbus discovers America, and things change forever. But I'm curious, beyond the textbook version, how did this contact immediately impact Native Americans?
It's important to understand that European arrival wasn't just a single event. It was the beginning of a long process of interaction, exchange, and unfortunately, exploitation. The Columbian Exchange brought about a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the old and new worlds. We often hear about the devastating impact of disease, which decimated native populations. But there's more to the story.
More to the story. In terms of impact?
Yes. The introduction of the horse, for instance. While it might seem like a footnote, it revolutionized life for many tribes, particularly on the Great Plains, increasing their mobility and transforming their hunting practices. Native Americans weren't passive recipients, they adapted and incorporated these new elements into their cultures.
So this period was more dynamic than just a one-sided story of conquest. There was cultural exchange, adaptation, and even moments of cooperation.
Right, absolutely. Early interactions involved trade, diplomacy, and even alliances between Native American tribes and different European powers. But as European settlements grew, so did the pressure on Native American land and resources. This led to shifting alliances, rising tensions, and ultimately conflict.
And this is where the concept of tribal sovereignty comes in.
Right.
This idea that tribes have their own forms of government.
But laws and exactly. In the early years of the United States, the federal government acknowledged this sovereignty to some extent. They engaged in treaty making with tribes, recognizing them as distinct political entities. But this recognition was always fragile, and the goal for many in the U.S. government was assimilation.
Assimilation meaning?
Pressuring Native Americans to abandon their cultures, languages, and ways of life and adopt European American norms. This idea of civilizing Native Americans was deeply intertwined with the desire to acquire their lands.
So, on the one hand, the U.S. acknowledges tribal sovereignty. On the other, they're actively working to dismantle native cultures and claim their territories.
It was a period of immense tension and contradiction. And as we move into the 19th century, we see a shift in U.S. policy that would have long-lasting consequences for Native Americans.
A shift toward
a more aggressive assertion of federal control. The 1871 Indian Appropriations Act is a pivotal moment. It essentially declared that the U.S. government would no longer treat Native American tribes as independent nations. They were redefined as domestic dependent nations, subject to federal law.
So, it's like pulling the rug out from under them. They go from negotiating treaties as sovereign nations to being classified as dependents of the U.S. government.
And this shift set the stage for policies like the creation of reservations, the infamous Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee Nation was forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands, resulting in thousands of deaths. It was a brutal and devastating chapter in American history, one that continues to resonate today.
Okay, we've reached a heavy point in our deep dive. Before we move on to the Civil Rights era and the modern-day challenges faced by Native Americans, let's pause here. We've covered a lot of ground, from pre-Columbian America to the devastating impact of European contact and the shifting dynamics of power and sovereignty.
It's a history fraught with complexity, resilience, and ongoing challenges, and as we move forward, it's crucial to see how those historical events continue to shape the landscape for Native Americans today.
I think that's a good bridge to our next point. The fight for civil rights. We often think of the civil rights movement as primarily focused on African Americans, but Native Americans were deeply involved in this fight for equality as well.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that while they share the struggle against racism and discrimination, their fight also had a unique dimension, the recognition of their inherent sovereignty.
So they were fighting on two fronts, for basic civil rights and for the right to self-governance.
Exactly, and sometimes these two fronts clashed in ironic ways. Take the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, for example. While it finally granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the U.S., it also brought them under the jurisdiction of state laws, which meant, particularly in the South, they were now subjected to the same Jim Crow laws that were designed to disenfranchise African Americans.
Wow, it's almost like a step forward and a step back at the same time.
Precisely, it highlights the complexities of this era. But despite these challenges, Native Americans were active participants in the broader civil rights movement. The National Indian Youth Council, for example, joined the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, demanding economic justice and self-determination. Their message wasn't about assimilation. It was about the right to a decent life on their own terms in their own communities.
That's a powerful statement. It speaks to the enduring strength of their cultural identity. Okay, so we've touched upon the historical struggles, but let's shift gears to the present. What are some of the pressing issues facing Native Americans today?
Well, the contemporary situation is like a tapestry with interconnected threads of social, economic, and political challenges. It's impossible to cover everything, but let's pull on a few of those threads to get a sense of the complexities.
Let's start with something that's sadly not unique to the Native American experience: societal discrimination and racism. I mean, we can go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, which labels Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. That's not exactly a promising foundation.
That statement, unfortunately, reflects a deep-seated prejudice that has persisted in various forms throughout American history, and it continues to manifest today in ways both overt and insidious.
When you say overt and insidious, what do you mean?
Well, the overt forms are easier to identify: hate crimes, violence, blatant discrimination. But then there are the insidious forms, the microaggressions, the stereotypes perpetuated in media and popular culture, the erasure of Native voices and perspectives. These subtle forms of racism can be just as damaging, chipping away at self-esteem and perpetuating harmful narratives.
It's like death by a thousand cuts. And then there's the whole debate about affirmative action, which has been a hot-button issue for decades. How does that play into the Native American experience?
Affirmative action is a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. Some see it as a necessary tool to level the playing field, to address the historical and ongoing disadvantages faced by marginalized groups, including Native Americans. Others argue that it can lead to reverse discrimination and doesn't address the root causes of inequality.
So finding that balance, that fair and effective approach, is a challenge. And speaking of challenging assumptions, let's talk about something that's been in the news a lot: Native American mascots in sports. I remember when the Washington Redskins finally changed their name to the Commanders. It felt like a symbolic victory, but it also sparked a lot of debate.
It did. The use of Native American imagery and names in sports has been controversial for decades. Opponents argue that it's a form of cultural appropriation that perpetuates harmful stereotypes and trivializes Native cultures. We've seen a shift in recent years with more schools and colleges dropping these mascots, and even professional teams like the Cleveland Guardians, formerly the Indians, making changes.
It seems like there's a growing awareness of the power dynamics at play, the way these images can be used to dehumanize and marginalize entire groups of people. Okay, let's switch gears to something that's often invisible but deeply impactful: historical trauma. What exactly does that mean in the context of Native American communities?
Historical trauma refers to the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that occurs over generations as a result of prolonged oppression, cultural disruption and violence, it's not just about individual experiences, it's about the collective trauma that's passed down through families and communities.
So it's like a wound that keeps getting reopened generation after generation. And I imagine this has a significant impact on mental health, substance abuse, and overall well-being.
You're absolutely right. The legacy of forced removals, the boarding school era where children were forcibly taken from their families and stripped of their cultures, the systematic attempts to erase native languages and traditions. These traumas don't simply vanish. They leave deep scars on individuals and communities.
And this historical trauma is intertwined with the economic struggles many Native American communities face today. It's not just about the past. There are real, tangible barriers to economic development and opportunity, right?
Yeah. Yes, and those barriers are often systemic and deeply rooted. The Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development has identified a number of factors that hinder economic growth in many Native communities, including lack of access to capital-limited infrastructure, distance from markets, and complex legal and bureaucratic hurdles associated with tribal sovereignty.
So it's this complex web of challenges, and it's easy to get bogged down in the difficulties, but I also think it's important to acknowledge the incredible resilience of Native American cultures. Despite centuries of oppression, they've survived, adapted, and are experiencing a resurgence in many ways.
You've hit a crucial point amidst these challenges. There's a vibrant tapestry of cultures waiting to be explored. Take language, for example. The linguistic diversity of Native America is astounding, and many tribes are working tirelessly to revitalize endangered languages. The Cherokee Nation's 10-year language preservation plan. It's a fantastic example of this commitment.
It's about reclaiming what was lost. Revitalizing those connections to ancestral knowledge and food, I think, is another powerful expression of cultural identity. Native American foodways are just as diverse as the tribes themselves, right?
Absolutely. Native American cuisine is a reflection of the unique environments and traditions of each tribe, from the Alaskan natives relying on fishing and hunting in Arctic conditions to the Three Sisters, crops, corn, beans, and squash, forming the foundation of agriculture in the eastern woodlands. Each region has its own distinct flavors and techniques.
I had the chance to try some traditional Native American foods, and it's incredible how interconnected the food is with the land and the culture. It's more than just sustenance. It's about preserving knowledge, celebrating heritage, and speaking of heritage, let's talk about religion and spirituality.
Native American religions and spiritual practices are incredibly diverse, but some common threads run through many traditions. A deep reverence for nature, the use of sacred herbs like sage and tobacco, sweat lodge ceremonies for purification and spiritual connection, and an emphasis on maintaining balance and harmony.
These traditions speak to a deep connection to the natural world, a way of life that's been disrupted but not destroyed.
Right, and what's fascinating is how these traditions have adapted and evolved. We see this in the Native American Church, which blends elements of Christianity with Native spiritual practices, and in the way Pueblo traditions are woven into Catholic masses in New Mexico. It speaks to the resilience and adaptability of these spiritual practices in the face of immense pressure.
It's like they've found ways to maintain their spiritual core while navigating the complexities of cultural exchange and sometimes forced assimilation.
Exactly. And this adaptability extends to gender roles as well. While stereotypes often depict Native American societies as rigidly patriarchal, the reality is far more nuanced. Many tribes historically had matrilineal societies where lineage and inheritance were traced through the mother's line, and women held significant positions of power and influence.
So breaking down those stereotypes yet again, and then of course we can't talk about Native American culture without mentioning the arts.
The artistic expressions of Native American cultures are as diverse as the tribes themselves, from the intricate beadwork and quillwork of the Plains tribes, often used to adorn clothing and ceremonial objects, to the stunning pottery of the Pueblo peoples. Each piece carries deep cultural significance.
And there's the power and symbolism of Navajo sand paintings, the totem poles of the Northwest Coast tribes, the wampum belts used by the Iroquois for storytelling and diplomacy. It's an incredible array of artistic traditions.
It is, and the Indian Art and Crafts Act of 1990 is crucial in this context because it protects the authenticity of Native American art. It ensures that only artists who are enrolled members of federally recognized tribes can market their work as Native American made, helping to combat the exploitation and appropriation of their cultural heritage.
It's about recognizing the value and the cultural significance of these art forms, ensuring that they are treated with respect, and that Native artists are fairly compensated for their work now before we move into our final section. I want to touch on something that's often overlooked, interracial relations. It's a complex and sometimes uncomfortable aspect of American history, but I think it's crucial to understanding the evolution of Native American identity.
You're right. It's a topic that's often overshadowed by the black-white racial binary that dominates so much of American discourse. But Native Americans have been interacting with, intermarrying with, and being impacted by other racial groups since the very beginning of European colonization.
So it's about acknowledging the diversity of experiences and relationships that have shaped Native American communities. Let's start with the issue of assimilation.
Assimilation has taken many forms throughout American history, from outright coercion to more subtle forms of pressure. The boarding school era is a particularly dark chapter in this history. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and sent to boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, and essentially for being Native American.
It's a heartbreaking example of how cultural erasure was used as a tool of assimilation, and even today, I imagine there are pressures both internal and external to conform to mainstream society.
Absolutely. There's this constant tension between wanting to preserve cultural identity and navigating a world that often expects conformity. And this brings us to another aspect of interracial relations that's often forgotten, the history of Native American enslavement by Europeans.
This is something that's rarely talked about, but it's a crucial part of the story, right?
It is. While various Native American tribes practiced forms of captivity and servitude before European contact, the arrival of Europeans dramatically transformed the nature of slavery in North America. Native Americans became caught in the transatlantic slave trade, sold as captives to Europeans and shipped to the West Indies and the American colonies.
So this wasn't just about European enslavement of Africans, it was a more complex and interconnected system of exploitation.
Exactly. And it's a part of history that's often overlooked, partly due to the difficulty in finding accurate records. Census data and vital statistics from that era often failed to differentiate between Native American slaves and indentured servants, making it difficult to quantify the true extent of this tragic chapter.
It adds another layer to this already intricate narrative of race power and exploitation in American history, and it brings us to the question of identity in the modern age. How is Native American identity defined today, especially after centuries of intermarriage assimilation and cultural change?
That's a question that's at the heart of many debates and discussions within Native American communities, and there's no easy answer. Native American identity is not a monolithic concept. It's multifaceted, encompassing tribal citizenship, cultural connection, and personal experience.
So it's more than just bloodlines, right? It's about belonging to a specific tribe, a community with its own history, culture, and governance.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of blood quantum comes in. Blood quantum is a system that's been used by the U.S. government and some tribes to determine eligibility for tribal enrollment and federal benefits. It's based on the percentage of Indian blood a person supposedly possesses.
I can already see how this could get complicated and controversial.
It is. Blood quantum is rooted in colonial ideas of race and purity, and has been criticized for being arbitrary, divisive, and ultimately an inaccurate measure of Native American identity.
It seems like it reduces identity to a fraction of blood percentage rather than acknowledging the cultural, historical, and spiritual dimensions.
Exactly. And it's led to situations where individuals who grew up immersed in their tribal culture have been denied enrollment because they don't meet a specific blood quantum requirement.
So there's this tension between wanting to preserve tribal identity and the reality of mixed ancestry, especially after centuries of intermarriage.
You've hit on a key point. And this tension is further complicated by the rise of DNA testing and the increasing number of people claiming Native American ancestry.
Right, because there's this idea floating around, particularly among some African Americans, of widespread Native American ancestry. I've heard countless family stories about a Cherokee grandmother or a Native American ancestor in the family tree.
Those stories are important and should be treated with respect, but it's also crucial to understand that family lore doesn't always align with genetic reality.
Are you saying those stories are often inaccurate?
Not necessarily inaccurate, but they might reflect cultural connections or family history that aren't necessarily based on direct genetic lineage, genetic research. Particularly studies like those featured in the PBS series African American Lives has revealed a more complex picture. While almost all African Americans have some degree of mixed ancestry, detectable Native American ancestry is actually less common than previously believed.
So those family stories might be more about a sense of connection or shared history rather than a direct genetic link.
Exactly. It's important to approach these stories with sensitivity and to understand that they may reflect cultural connections or family lore rather than direct genetic links. And it highlights the limitations of using DNA testing to define or claim Native American identity.
So a DNA test might tell you you have a small percentage of Native American ancestry, but it can't tell you which tribe you're connected to or whether you qualify for tribal enrollment.
Precisely. And it's important to note that many tribes are wary of the use of DNA testing to define Native American identity. They see it as another form of colonialism, where genetic information is used to control and define who is and isn't Native American, potentially undermining tribal sovereignty.
It's like trying to reduce a rich and complex culture to a DNA sequence.
Exactly. And while some tribes may use DNA testing for paternity confirmation to establish biological relationships within the tribe, it's not about defining race or ethnicity. It's about verifying familial connections within a specific community.
So it's another example of how these issues require nuanced context and a deeper understanding of the cultural and political dimensions.
Absolutely, and it brings us to another layer of complexity, the ongoing debate surrounding the use of genetics to define Native American identity, particularly in the context of scientific research and historical narratives.
Okay, let's delve into that a bit further. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
It's a thorny issue. On the one hand, genetic research can potentially offer valuable insights into population history, migration patterns, and the connections between different groups. But on the other hand, there's a real danger of this information being misused to reinforce harmful stereotypes or undermine tribal sovereignty.
Can you give me an example of how this might play out?
Well, imagine a study that claims to have identified a specific genetic marker that's unique to a particular tribe. This information could then be used to question the legitimacy of other tribes or individuals who don't share that marker, even if they have strong cultural and historical connections to that tribal identity.
So it's about recognizing that genetics is just one piece of the puzzle, and it can't be used in isolation to define something as complex as cultural identity.
Exactly. It's crucial to approach genetic research in a way that respects the sovereignty and self-determination of Native American tribes. And that means involving them in the research process, ensuring that their perspectives and concerns are heard, and that the results are used in a way that benefits their communities.
It sounds as we're talking about a shift from a top-down approach to research where scientists dictate the terms to a more collaborative model where tribes are active participants in shaping the research agenda.
That's exactly the direction we need to be moving in. And it's not just about research, it's about representation in all aspects of society. Native American voices need to be at the table when decisions are being made about policies that affect their communities, from education and healthcare to land management and economic development.
So it's about moving beyond this idea of Native Americans as subjects of study or recipients of aid and recognizing their agency, their right to shape their own destinies.
Precisely. And that means supporting their efforts to revitalize their cultures, languages, and traditions. It means honoring their treaties and respecting their sovereignty. It means acknowledging the historical injustices they faced and working to create a more just and equitable future.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from pre-Columbian civilizations to the complexities of identity in the 21st century. As we wrap up, is there a final thought, a key takeaway that you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important takeaway is this. The story of Native Americans in the United States is an ongoing story, a story of resilience, resistance, and resurgence. It's a story that's often been marginalized, misrepresented, or simply ignored, but it's a story that's essential to understanding the fabric of this nation.
It's a story that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to rethink our assumptions, and to work towards a future where Native American voices are heard, their cultures are celebrated, and their sovereignty is respected.
Beautifully said. And that work begins with education, with listening to Native American perspectives, with supporting organizations that are working to empower Native communities.
We've only scratched the surface in this deep dive, but hopefully it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more. There are incredible resources available online, in libraries, and within Native communities themselves.
Seek out those voices, those stories, those perspectives. The more we learn, the more we understand, the better equipped we are to be allies and advocates for a more just and equitable future for Native American peoples.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Native Americans in the United States. I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this journey. I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the complexities of this topic and that you'll continue to explore these issues on your own. Until next time, keep diving deep.